There is a quiet moment that often defines the contrast. It appears in the pause between conversations, in the way streets empty earlier than expected, and in how politeness seems to stretch time itself. For Australians encountering life in Canada, the difference rarely announces itself loudly. Instead, it settles in slowly, through atmosphere rather than events. The familiarity of another Western country initially creates a sense of ease, yet beneath its surface, the social rhythm operates on an entirely different frequency. Early impressions are often shaped by order. Canadian cities feel measured, carefully paced, and emotionally restrained. Interactions unfold with a consistent courtesy that feels deliberate rather than spontaneous. For Australians, accustomed to a more relaxed social tempo and informal public behaviour, this politeness can feel almost architectural, structured, predictable, and omnipresent. Even casual exchanges appear to follow invisible guidelines, where warmth exists but is carefully contained. The physical environment reinforces this emotional tone. Long winters shape indoor life, narrowing social circles and encouraging routine over improvisation. Streets feel quieter, voices softer, and public spaces more controlled. Where Australian cities often feel outward-facing, driven by weather and outdoor movement, Canadian life tends to pull inward. Homes become central, schedules become firm, and social spontaneity yields to planning. The climate does not simply influence clothing choices, it shapes expectations around energy, availability, and emotional expression. Beneath this lies a deeper difference in social signalling. Australians often communicate comfort through teasing, irony, and emotional openness, even among strangers. In Canada, respect is more frequently expressed through restraint. Silence is not awkward but considerate. Distance is not disinterest but caution. This can initially register as emotional coolness, though over time it reveals itself as a form of social protection, an unspoken agreement to avoid intrusion. Everyday routines highlight these contrasts further. Workplace culture emphasizes consensus and careful language, often prioritizing harmony over blunt honesty. Social invitations feel polite but conditional, extended slowly and rarely on impulse. Even friendships tend to develop through consistency rather than intensity. For Australians, this can create a sense of emotional buffering, where connection exists but takes longer to fully surface. What makes the experience disorienting is not hostility or exclusion, but subtle emotional recalibration. The absence of overt conflict, loud humour, or casual confrontation creates an environment that feels calm yet distant. Over time, many Australians begin to notice that life in Canada is less about expressive release and more about emotional regulation. The culture values steadiness over spontaneity, predictability over improvisation, and consideration over candour, differences that quietly reshape expectations long before they are consciously understood. As time passes, these differences begin to appear not as isolated traits, but as a coherent system. Canadian social life operates on an ethic of emotional risk management. Interactions are designed to remain safe, respectful, and non-disruptive. For Australians, whose social norms often allow friction as a pathway to closeness, this can feel like a layer of glass between people. Conversations remain pleasant, yet rarely spill into vulnerability without prolonged familiarity. This dynamic is especially visible in group settings. Social gatherings tend to be orderly, time-bound, and purpose-driven. There is an emphasis on inclusion without intensity, where everyone is acknowledged but few stand out. Australians, more accustomed to loose structure and expressive group energy, may notice how quickly gatherings wind down or how rarely conversations drift into personal territory. The atmosphere remains warm but controlled. Public behaviour reinforces this emotional moderation. Canadians are highly aware of shared space, volume, and social impact. Apologies are frequent, not necessarily because of guilt, but as a form of social lubrication. This constant signalling of consideration creates a smooth public experience, though it can also suppress emotional extremes. For Australians, whose cultural confidence often embraces presence and assertiveness, this restraint can initially feel like self-erasure rather than politeness. Even humour operates differently. Australian humour frequently leans on exaggeration, irreverence, and social testing. In Canada, humour is gentler, often self-deprecating but rarely confrontational. Jokes avoid sharp edges, prioritizing comfort over reaction. Over time, Australians may find themselves subconsciously softening their tone, adjusting volume, or filtering instinctive responses to align with local expectations. These adjustments are rarely demanded explicitly. They occur quietly through observation and repetition. Canadians rarely correct behavior directly, instead responding through subtle shifts in engagement. Invitations become less frequent, conversations shorter, enthusiasm muted. For Australians, used to direct feedback and open disagreement, this indirect signalling can be difficult to interpret. Silence replaces confrontation, and distance replaces debate. The emotional climate of Canada, shaped by climate, history, and social values, ultimately rewards patience. Trust is built slowly, but once formed, it tends to be stable and enduring. Relationships emphasize reliability over intensity, presence over performance. Australians who remain long enough often recognize that beneath the reserved exterior lies a deep commitment to fairness, respect, and emotional safety, values expressed not through volume or spontaneity, but through consistency and care. Yet the adjustment requires an internal shift. Energy is redistributed, expectations recalibrated, and emotional expression refined. The culture shock is not dramatic, but cumulative, settling into daily life in ways that are easy to overlook but impossible to ignore once fully felt. Over time, this slow accumulation of differences begins to alter perception itself. Many Australians discover that life in Canada subtly trains emotional awareness inward rather than outward. Expression becomes measured, reactions moderated, and social presence carefully calibrated. The environment encourages self-monitoring, not through pressure, but through gentle reinforcement. Calm becomes the default, and emotional neutrality the baseline from which deviations are noticed. This transformation is most evident in how comfort is defined. In Australia, comfort often emerges through ease, informal language, relaxed boundaries, and social elasticity. In Canada, comfort is built through predictability, knowing what is appropriate, when to speak, how much to share, and when to step back creates a sense of security. The result is a society that feels emotionally smooth, yet less expressive on the surface. Stability replaces spontaneity as the primary social currency. Daily life reflects this philosophy. Schedules are respected, commitments honored, and personal space protected. Emotional highs and lows are softened, not suppressed, but carefully contained. Australians may notice that even moments of celebration carry an undercurrent of restraint, while moments of tension are diffused before they escalate. The culture prioritizes emotional continuity over emotional release. With time, many Australians find themselves adapting in quiet ways. Voice is lower. Humor becomes subtler. Social expectations are anticipated rather than tested. What initially felt distant begins to feel dependable. The reserved nature of Canadian society reveals its strength not in immediate connection, but in long-term consistency. Trust, once established, is rarely theatrical but deeply rooted. The culture shock, then, is not about difference alone, but about contrast in emotional philosophy. Canada does not invite individuals to stand out. It invites them to fit in gently. It does not reward intensity, but balance. For Australians, whose cultural identity often celebrates openness and expressive ease, this can feel like emotional compression. Yet for some, it also brings an unexpected sense of calm, a slower emotional weather, less volatile and more predictable. In the end, life in Canada reshapes not behavior, but interpretation. Silence becomes meaningful rather than empty. Distance feels respectful rather than cold. Politeness transforms from habit into value. What once felt unfamiliar gradually becomes legible. And within that legibility, many Australians come to understand that the difference they sensed from the beginning was not about friendliness or warmth, but about how a society chooses to care for emotional space, quietly, patiently, and without spectacle.